Can you all hear me? Great. So welcome. I know this is the last session, so we're going to try and give you enough food for thought for the rest of the weekend. And thank you for coming here on a Saturday, especially those of you present here in Nicosia on this beautiful day. Thank you to all the organizers and the hosts. I know that you're all doing your very best in spite of the technical challenges we've been having, so thank you all. We have quite an important panel to finish our conference with, and as you probably can see from the program, we're going to look at the implications of the geopolitical crisis in the Middle East for the Mediterranean region. My name is Michelle Patch, and I'm professor in global studies, currently based at Oxford University Development Studies Department. I have the pleasure to have a very distinguished group of people on my panel today, so I won't spend a long time to introduce you because everything is on the program, but I just want to say that the way that I have recommended we structure this panel is to kind of think in terms of three spheres. One is a diagnosis of what's been going on. So for the speakers to bring us up to scratch about what's been going on, including until this very moment before we came to this panel, for those of you who are following developments as we speak. Then I would like the speakers to talk in terms of consequences. And finally, in order to finish as much as we can with some kind of positive reflection, I want us to think about political imaginations. So just by way of introducing the topic, as you all know, the Middle East and North Africa has been engulfed in a fully fledged regional crisis, but I should add, as we have already said in various panels before this, that this has engulfed not only the region itself, but it has had a huge global impact. And that is why we are here today to reflect and think about, I would say, three main questions. So the first question is, what has actually changed structurally in the region? The second is, what does this mean for Europe and the Mediterranean political order? And thirdly, what political imaginaries remain possible? So I'm going to split this panel into two rounds. So I first want to ask our speakers to kindly reflect about the diagnosis. So tell us a little bit whether we are witnessing a temporal regional escalation or whether there is a much more fundamental transformation of the Middle East and the Mediterranean order. And secondly, what does the current crisis reveal about the condition of the international normative framework, particularly, as we have been noting, international law, multilateralism, and civilian protection. So without further ado, I'm going to ask first Kostas Maronitis, who is professor at Leeds Trinity University, to set us the pace. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. And thank you very much for being here. And thank you to FEPS for the invitation. And thank you to Beatrice and Tanya for their hospitality and organization. When it comes to this kind of like idea about temporary or permanent transformations in the Middle East, I would like to focus my response to two interrelated events, distinctive yet interrelated events. The first one is energy alliances. There has been a push across Europe for strategic autonomy. And usually this kind of push comes from the big players when it comes to France, when they were talking about strategic autonomy from the US, then what's coming from the UK when they put up the coalition of the willing to do something again besides or outside of the confinements of US foreign policy. But also something else is happening here, which is a dialectical relationship between the core of Europe and the periphery of Europe. So here I'm talking about core member states and actors in the Mediterranean, which are part of the EU or not. And I'm talking about the East Med pipeline. The East Med pipeline was actually conceived as an idea of diversifying the consumption of energy in Europe. Greece, Israel, and Cyprus, and a little bit of Italy in terms of infrastructure. They wanted to have a pipeline that transfers gas from the Levantine basin to up until to Europe, mainly up to Italy. This project, as you know, has never materialized. It has never happened. And last time I checked, like 2-3 days ago, the webpage of the State Department, they have dropped the concept altogether. It just doesn't exist. But this diversification of energy here was actually, it was problematic in many respects. The partners conceived this idea as a clever plan to bypass Turkey and isolate Turkey from this particular kind of region. Turkey objected to this particular plan. The plan was never going to materialize because even the initial bill was too low. It was, no one is actually quite invested in this particular thing. Americans were, the Italians were, the Greeks were, but the East Med pipeline served a completely different purpose. It had nothing to do with energy, it had something to do with politics. And we saw how we have like different alliances within NATO, outside NATO, and above NATO, okay? And the common denominator in this kind of like East Med pipeline here was this idea that how we can isolate Turkey. It's kind of like complicated in a particular way because Turkey is a defense ally of Greece, okay, and that's a fact. Turkey and Cyprus have an ongoing dispute about, the so-called like Cypriot problem, and Israel, as we heard from like yesterday, has also identified Turkey as the new constitutive other. Turkey is second in order after Iran when it comes to Israel's constitutive other in the region. The problem here is that we use the East Med pipeline served as a means to justify Israel's action. And something against that we discussed yesterday is the concept of Strasson, this idea that how Germany saw Israel's safety as of paramount importance for Germany's well-being too and national security. Those two things go together. We see here kind of like a reverse of this particular Strasson here, whereas Greece and Cyprus see it as of paramount importance, Israel's hegemony in the area. By doing so, Israel gets like a carte blanche when it comes to genocide and to its aggression in the particular area, when it comes to Lebanon, when it comes to Gaza, and of course when it comes to the war in Iran. The second transformation that I would like to point out here is of an industrial nature, that Europe decided, especially after the war in Ukraine, to reindustrialize itself. And this reindustrialization did not take the form of the automotive industry, of home appliances, and so on and so forth. It took the form of the military-industrial complex, that we have to reindustrialize, and this time we have to make our own arms. Okay? So companies like Rheinmetall, Leonardo in Italy, Rheinmetall in Germany, Safran in France, took the leading position to accept and utilize European funds in order to boost the European defense industry. That kind of exacerbated the existing inequalities between core and periphery, because Mediterranean countries in Europe do not have the industrial capacity to compete with these particular countries. The outcome that we have seen thus far is that Mediterranean countries have become buyers in this particular kind of situation, and buyers of products that they do not necessarily need or want. They just have to buy them because this is how the core periphery model operates. With one exception here, we can see how the Mediterranean has become an industrial player, is with this idea of drone making. Drones because they're cheaper and easy to produce, and of course you can kill without being killed. So you kill people but do not necessarily have human casualties. Thank you. And the kind of like tip to make, Mediterranean countries have been part of consortia of making drones. And as a matter of fact, there is a drone factory in this country, in Limassol, the Suomli factory that make drones. So they have found a way to participate in this kind of like rearmament of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostas. Now we move to our online speaker, Trita Parsi. Are you there?
I am here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So Trita, for those of you who do not know him, he's a very specialized author and political analyst on particularly issues to do with US and Iran. And he is the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. On to you, Trita. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I'm hoping that the conversation can nevertheless be fruitful for all of you. In regards to your question, are we witnessing a temporary regional escalation or more fundamental transformation? If I focus just on the eastern side of this equation at the Persian Gulf, I think the answer is rather clear. This is a systemic and structural shift that is taking place in the region. The old order is completely gone. All of the assumptions of the old order have to be reassessed. There was an order that for decades had been, the organizing principle had been the isolation and the containment of Iran. And the means for achieving that had been the American security umbrella. Both of these have now proven to be unviable as a result of the war that the United States and Israel initiated. The isolation of Iran has both failed in the sense of isolating and weakening the country, but also in the sense of ensuring that containment is stable and does not deteriorate into war. We have seen that the Iranians have been able to inflict a strategic defeat on the United States, despite the fact that we have now two nuclear weapon states, as well as one of them being a superpower, starting this war, but not having been able to achieve even a fraction of their objectives. This then leads to a scenario and also in which the viability of the US security umbrella is now under significant question. I don't see any prospects of any of the countries in the region, with the potential exception of the UAE, going back into thinking that its approach of investing almost exclusively in the security umbrella, as well as in its strategic now alliance with Israel, that is a successful pathway forward after this war. We're going to see diversification by the GCC states, not abandoning the United States, but moving towards building defense relationships with a much greater variety of countries, buying weapons from a much greater variety of countries, rather than just the United States. They will not abandon the relationship with the US. In fact, when it comes to weapons purchases, they will likely pursue even greater purchases from these states. But a core element of their previous strategy, which was to have American bases on their territory, is probably going to be phased out, because these bases were supposed to prevent Iran from starting a war. But it was actually the United States itself that started that war. And then within that war, the bases did not end up becoming a deterrent against the Iranians, but rather a magnet for their attacks. So the strategic utility of having these 17 or 19 bases in the region has now come under significant question. And mindful of the fact that these countries themselves paid for these bases, and they are now strapped for cash given what has happened, or at least most of them. The question is, are they going to spend money rebuilding these American bases who have suffered tremendous damage? The US itself is certainly not going to pay for the rebuilding of these bases. So I suspect that we will see a phasing out of a lot of these bases, not necessarily all of them. Now, at the same time, there is no other option for the GCC states in the sense of finding another country that can play the role of the United States. there is no country willing to come and provide that type of a security umbrella as the US did. And the question then will be for these regional states, are they going to try to pursue a replacement of the US through a combination of countries, which I think is quite likely. But within that, what will the new balance be between containing Iran and seeking some form of engagement and economic integration with it? The previous balance was overwhelmingly tilted in favor of containment. US sanctions did not allow for the type of economic integration that some of them wanted, and some of them even had signed agreements with Iran. So the overwhelming tilt was in favor of just containment. And an honest assessment coming out of this war is going to be needed in order for these GCC countries to make a determination if it was the containment that failed or it was the integration that failed. And I think most of them will come to the conclusion, perhaps not happily, but nevertheless, that the tilt was far too much in the direction of containment. And as a result, far greater integration economically is going to be needed with Iran as part of the security equation for these different countries. And that again goes completely against the organizing principle of the previous order, which was to simply isolate and exclude Iran from regional affairs. So I think we're going to see a significant shift that will make the region very, very different from what it was before. And to a certain extent, it almost will go in this direction regardless of the final outcome of this war, whether there is an agreement between the United States and Iran or if there isn't. Let me also just add one more point, which is that the grand strategic implications of this war that goes beyond the region is going to be far greater than the implications that we saw from the failed invasion or the failed war with Iran, with Iraq in 2003. Because in the Iraq war, there was no doubt that the United States had won the war militarily. It won it militarily within 3 weeks. There was really no contest. Moreover, the political objective of getting rid of the Saddam Hussein regime was also achieved. All of the problems came afterwards, and all of the question marks about American competence came afterwards. What you have in the Iranian situation is that the United States has not even been able to win this militarily, and nor has it achieved any of its political objectives. And as a result, I think we will have question marks about the reliability and the durability and effectiveness of the American security umbrella in other regions as well, not just in the Persian Gulf region, because the manner in which the Iranians could use their geography in a very effective way to counter this attack by the US and Israel is somewhat unique because of the tremendous importance of the Strait of Hormuz, but it is not so unique that it cannot be replicable by other countries in other regions. And I think that is now, I don't think we have fully internalized this, but I think it will have significant repercussions for other regions, particularly when it comes to Asia. So on so many different levels, I think we're seeing something that is far more structural than temporary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trita. And now we move on to Kostas. To my right, Mavridis, who is a member of the European Parliament of the S&D Group.
Thank you. Very well. Thank you. My name is Kostas Mavridis. Just before telling you about my views regarding the implications of the recent events, especially around the Mediterranean and the Middle East, I feel that I need to tell you a few words about welcoming you, Cyprus, because this is my home. At the same time, I want you to know that this is my third term in the European Parliament. And to understand my point of view, I need to tell you that I'm a member of the Economic Affairs Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and the Defense and Security Committee. At the same time, during 2019 until 2014, so last term, I was the chair of the Political Committee for the Mediterranean. So I do have a view about the problems and perhaps the future of this area, taking in consideration that I was born and raised here in Cyprus. with that in mind, I'm going to say this just to get your attention. I was among the very few, if not the first one, from the area that argue in the parliament, the European Parliament, about the need for security and defense for Europe. That was before the Russian invasion in Ukraine. To get your attention even more, I was among the very few, perhaps the only one, in 2021 in S&D that I argue that we have an impending housing crisis. And I would say that Nicola Schmidt, the Spitzenkandidat for S&D in 2024, and of course, a major political figure for FEPS, he adopted that in his own agenda during 2024 elections. The housing, the need for European housing approach. Why did I say that? Because today I will make perhaps at least one more prediction, and we will see if I'm going to be right. Hopefully now I got your attention. First, I need to say that what we face in the Middle East has already been explained by the speakers before. The international law is falling, or it's diminishing. Not that it worked pretty well for the last decades, but it was, in a way, it was at least a moral base for small member states, especially member states of EU or the United Nations, just like Cyprus. And maybe I should praise the Republic of Cyprus for even today taking the principal stance against Russian invasion, despite the fact that Russia had close ties with Cyprus over the last maybe 20 years. And this goes back economic ties, but even this goes back to religious and historical ties. So for Cyprus, it was a matter of principle, defending the UN, the international law. What are my predictions for the future? I'm going to resort to an authoritative source from ancient Greece, Thucydides. He is considered, by the way, he was on the spotlight the last few months, at least twice. Once by the Prime Minister of Canada, and very recently by the Chinese president. They make reference to Thucydides. And whenever, in a way, Thucydides, for those who don't know much about him, he was an ancient Greek, let's say, politician or military man who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, a civil war between Sparta and Athens, but he wrote it in a way to send messages not on what was going on then at the time, but for humanity in the future. And the number one before the lesson, I would say that he defined as motives for war two main incentives: self-interest and fear. Self-interest and fear. With that in mind, here are my predictions about our area. First, and this is not a new idea, but what is new is that it's been widely accepted, not only by political figures, but also by the EU institutions recently. The significance of Mediterranean for EU is widely accepted and acknowledged, to the fact that now we even have a commissioner for the Mediterranean. This is something that not only me, but many others from the area who have argued for it, but now it is widely accepted by even the European Commission and other institutions. And I can give you more examples about that, but I would say regarding irregular migration, about geopolitics, about energy security, especially the transition period, and getting finally to the neutral economy of fully clean energy, and climate change and many other issues. So yes, the importance of the Mediterranean, not only for the countries around the Mediterranean basin, but for Europe as well itself. The second prediction, well, in this matter, I would disagree in a way with Kostas sitting next to me. We do have the same name, but it seems like he has K, I have C. Well, when it comes to Turkey, I will make a prediction, and you will see if I'm right. Turkey is not isolated. Turkey is an expansionist power. And in fact, I would dare to say the following. It's a neo-Ottoman expansionist policy, and many countries around the area, and not only Cyprus or Greece, but third countries around Turkey and even beyond, suffer from that expansionist policy, the neo-Ottoman expansionist policy. By the way, Turkey called it recently, they call it blue homeland. I don't call it blue homeland. Blue homeland, or the blue homeland, is the Mediterranean for all of us. What Turkey has for us, I call it the neo-Ottoman blue fantasy, to take over, to expand. I will give you an example, or maybe I can give you many examples. 2 minutes. Oh, yes. Just 1 kilometer from here, we have the Attila occupation line. Why do I call it Attila? Because Turkey calls it an Attila. This is EU territory under illegal occupation. Another example, in Syria, Turkey has invaded and remains there with occupational military forces. After the overthrow of the Assad regime, what happened to the occupation of Syria? Anyone knows? Did anyone hear about withdrawal of Turkish forces from Syria? No. So, yes, here in the Mediterranean, unfortunately, we have an expansionist power that we don't isolate it. We don't isolate it because just like we didn't isolate German SS Hitler regime, we don't isolate Iran. So with that in mind, I would say that, yes, there are many things that I don't like about Israel or about Iran or what's happening around us, but sometimes we do have to make choices. That's all.
Thank you, Kostas. It's good that we have some challenging reflections also on the panel, so I'm looking forward to the Q&A already. But before that, I'll pass the floor to Ino Afentuli, who is a senior policy advisor and head of the Observatory of Geopolitics and Diplomacy at the Hellenic Foundation for Foreign and European Policy, also known as ELIAMEP. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our hosts for this very interesting gathering. I believe it's very, hopefully my co-panelist didn't raise the issues I was going to raise, so I'm glad that I can add to our discussion and then having an exchange during our Q&As. So look, I will start by questioning, as you gave us guidance and it was very, very useful. I will start by questioning if in the MENA or in the Med region, we can have the transfer of the European paradigm. So what I mean by that? First of all, to examine if we have a deep transformation in our region and further in the Gulf, the answer is positive. Certainly we have a deep transformation in the region. Why? Because we have passed from the era of multilateralism to the era of great power competition. So the middle powers that belong to both regions will strive to get the approval or the assistance of one of the big powers. because otherwise they cannot sustain their regimes or their situation, because then you enter in, you don't have rules. Mrs. Mogherini put the framework correctly, very rightly so, and I fully agree with what she said. You have, if you have a framework, it's not a framework of cooperation. It's a framework of imposition, of projection of power. So if you are a middle, or even worse, a small power, so you are trying to attract the attention of a big power. And this is what is happening now in the Gulf, first of all. And the Gulf, don't forget, is a powerful region, rich in energy resources and in development. So I will differentiate the Gulf from the Mediterranean because it's totally different. And in the Gulf, we never had the ambition, Europeans, to impose the European model in the Gulf. It's out of question. And the main danger coming out of this crisis will be Iran to become or to remain a black hole. If Iran remains a black hole, then we will not have peace and security in this very important region for the international balance. This is one point. Another point, when we come to the Mediterranean and the Middle East around the Mediterranean, we have to admit that we never had, European Union, a grand strategy for the region. Why? Because, let's be honest, some countries wouldn't like to have the region integrated. There was never, let's say, the enlargement process never had reached the Mediterranean. Okay? The enlargement process, which is a very successful story for the EU, aimed at bringing together the two parts of Europe, Western, Eastern, Central, and consolidate peace and stability across the continent. The European project, I can say, never crossed the Mediterranean for various reasons that we cannot elaborate now, but we had not for the South a grand strategy. This is something that I don't think anybody could contradict. So, can we have a grand strategy now? We could, if there was willingness, political willingness to expand the not European Union, because it would be very difficult, to expand at least our model along specific rules. And of course, to provide the tools and mechanism and funding to the countries of the region to abide by our standards. This is something that could be realistic and feasible, but I'm afraid the region will be the victim, and I'm not saying that out of opposition to what we are doing in Ukraine. What we are doing in Ukraine is very important, and we have to finish the job in Ukraine. We made an extra effort. European Union, I think, surprised everybody with the assistance offered in Ukraine. But there, we have the need to secure Europe. To secure Europe, what we are going to do, we are going to rearm. All right, correctly so, we have to rearm. We need strategic autonomy in the light of the US drift from Europe. But can we do both? Can we do at the same time East and South? This is something I have many doubts about, because we will need, as I said, a lot of funding, and I don't know how the prioritization of the European institutions will be in the coming years. There are some other, if I have time, I don't know. Okay. So, to conclude, and then to continue, if you wish, with the second round, I would put also at our table, especially in the progressive framework, the Turkish issue. because we tend, in the European Union framework, to marginalize what is happening inside Turkey. And what is happening inside Turkey recently is an additional proof of the country's drift towards autocracy. And it is happening to a party, the opposition party, which is member, if I'm not mistaken, of the Socialist International. So, and there is not even a statement coming from the European institutions about what is happening to the main opposition party, which belongs to the Socialist International. So I will stop here, and we will continue later on.
Thank you very much, Ino. So I'm just going to gather a few reflections I had from this first round, and we are privileged to have Federica with us. So one of the main points that I took away from this first round is that the whole instrument of dialogue at the EU, how can we bring that back on the table? Because we did, for example, have an exemplary agreement by the E3 with Iran, which you were very privy to. So maybe we can reflect a little bit about some of the core instruments that Europe and the EU particularly used to have, and whether this is something that, as you all mentioned, I think, and you all pointed at in various ways, how can we use that kind of model, yes, to bring to the table some of these possible, discussions with partners, not only to the east, but also to the south. The one challenge that was brought up by Ino, which I have to mention, is that you mentioned that we bring partners to abide by our standards. Unfortunately, I have to say that our standards are ones that we no longer keep ourselves. So this makes the model very problematic. And you mentioned that we have been exemplary in the manner in which we have embraced the issue with Ukraine, but we mentioned also yesterday that this was not the case, for example, with Gaza. So I think we need to also be self-reflective about what we have done which worked, why it worked, and then what we have not done and why we have not done so, because this is very much pointing to the second round about the international normative frame. So I think we go straight to the second round, and then I just want to leave space for the audience to participate. So in the second round, it kind of follows from the first round. I want you all to reflect a little bit how, these kind of transformations, these shifts, how are they reshaping not only the Mediterranean, as you all mentioned, but Europe and also beyond. So we mentioned the war economy, we mentioned migration briefly, we mentioned energy security, we mentioned militarization, but also I think importantly, what is happening to the political space? What is happening to democratic politics? So I want you to reflect first on that point, and then secondly, I would like you to perhaps take a few moments to ask ourselves as a community now of so-called progressives. I still want us to think about what progressive means today, though. But let's assume that we are all, thinking reflectively and in an imaginative way. When these extreme forms of violence that we are seeing across the world, when this kind of extreme violence is becoming more and more normalized, can we actually allow for space of political imagination? So we heard from the previous panel the importance of youth. We heard the importance of those pockets of civil society that are not necessarily heard in Brussels and are not given the kind of platforms that we would like to see. So I want to continue with the previous panels, both this morning and yesterday. So these are the questions I want, to reflect about. And we'll start again with Kostas to my far right, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. When I was thinking about the question about the international law and the legal order, I also thought about the moral order that sometimes is largely forgotten. And recently, like a month ago, I came across a statement by Daniel Reisner. Daniel Reisner was the former head of the Israeli Defense Forces legal department. And he was talking about international law. And I quote, "If you do something for long enough, the world will accept it. International law progresses through violations. We invented the targeted assassination thesis, and we had to push it. It's very interesting here that there's no such thing as international law, as Mr. Reisner is telling us here. International law is something that you violate and you violate and you violate until we accept it. It becomes a normal state of affairs. We have seen it in Gaza when politician after politician accepted the fact that Gazans can be cut off from food, water, electricity. They took it as a fact that Israel has the right to do this particular thing. Friedrich Merz, when Israel bombed Iran, actually said that Israel is doing the dirty job for us. We're too ashamed, too timid to do such a thing, but they're doing it on our behalf. Okay, that's part of the international law. So whenever we're thinking about the international law has been violated, it actually helps to say who's violating the international law, how they're doing it, and what substantiates ideologically, economically, and politically these particular actions. That's why, for instance, I talked about the Strat actions. This kind of idea that Israel's hegemony is for our own good, is for the national interest, regardless of this destabilization in the area. Okay, so it is a big problem when it comes to this kind of how we justify and we continue to justify the breaking of the international law. Now, you might as well ask me, why is this a problem? Why do we care about the breaking of the international law? Why is such a problem for Europe, generally speaking? I have 2 points when it comes to this kind of questions that I set up to myself. The first one is about democratic accountability, and it's about the rights of citizens to raise these issues when it comes to international law. Citizens in the European member states have been prosecuted because of these kind of things. National governments did not even bother to bring back the people from the Simut flotilla back to their own countries. As a matter of fact, Turkey brought them to Turkey, and then they had to go back to their own countries with their own expenses. Another important thing here, when talking about the position of Europe within the wider world, okay? Europe has lost moral and legal authority when it comes to the Middle East. And evidence of these particular loss is that Europe is absent. When was the last time that we saw Europe hosting an event when it comes to peace in the Middle East? You cannot even remember. When was the last time that Europe set up an initiative about peace in the Middle East? We cannot even remember. These discussions happen in Qatar, they happen in Istanbul, but they don't happen in Switzerland anymore, they don't happen in Finland anymore, they don't happen in Iceland anymore, they don't happen in Norway anymore, because it's not only about the Europeans have lost interest, they have lost the capacity to do so, and the rest of the world are not willing to listen to them anymore. Europe's kind of reindustrialization agenda is equally problematic because it actually exposed the hypocrisy of the European Union when it comes to debt. There was always a debt issue, when it comes to public ownership of goods. There was a debt issue when it comes to infrastructure, when it was a debt issue when the state would intervene to stimulate demand. We know all these kind of things with, all this kind of memoranda of austerity. But there has never been an issue when it comes to debt, when it comes to buying and making arms. Basically, debt is actually good for the economy, it seems. And it is a big problem because all these kind of countries that were trying to stimulate the economy outside of the confines of the IMF and the European Central Bank failed to do so. But now the European Union does not seem to have a problem when it comes to the issue of arms and who's going to buy arms and who's going to make arms. This idea of having this military Keynesianism that, yes, the state can intervene to stimulate the market when you have to buy arms, when you have to meet the new targets for NATO membership. Okay, so we need to actually consider what is the space of Europe. Even the most timid things that the European Union does, which actually raise funds and impose sanctions, this is what Europe excels at, actually, sanctions and sanctions and sanctions, and raise funds for Ukraine and other kind of things. Even with this particular thing, thank you very much, has failed to do so when it comes to Israel. We don't have any horizontal sanctions when it comes to the actions of Israel. It has nothing to do with even to kind of discomfort the Israeli economy when it comes to these actions in Iran, Lebanon, and Gaza. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Kostas, and I pass the floor to you, Trita, please.
Thank you. I think I will be somewhat brief on this second part, but I really want to associate myself with Kostas' comments here and perhaps complain a little bit about Europe sitting here in Washington, and I'll explain why in a second. Just a couple of things I think we have to remind ourselves to understand the depths that Europe has sunk to when it comes to standing up for international law, norms around the use of force, principles that Europe itself was crucial in establishing, that have been a pillar for Europe's own security, and seeing the manner in which it is now being abandoned actively by European leaders is a sad sight to see. In the case of the attack on Iran back in the summer, the German chancellor said that Israel was doing Europe's dirty work for it. On Venezuela, the German chancellor said that the question of the legality of this operation is a question to be debated at a different moment. International law, it's not the moment to discuss international law. The Swedish prime minister said on Swedish TV that when it comes to Sweden's position on Iran, the American attack on Iran, that Sweden's assessment as to whether this was the right decision to do or not, or whether Sweden would support or not, will depend on the outcome. If it works, Sweden will support it. If it doesn't work, Sweden will oppose it. I mean, you couldn't get more of a parody of what international law is supposed to operate like. And Merce also said, incidentally, that international law apparently does not apply to Iran because of the structure of that regime, a regime that we can all oppose. But this is just fundamentally assassinating the very principles that some of the most important principles that underlie the entire structure of international law. These attacks are not coming from China. These attacks are not coming from Putin. These attacks are coming from European leaders. And it's from an American standpoint, at least speaking for those of us who are in the restrained community here, this is a terrible sight to see, something that we see as being a function of Europe having made itself increasingly dependent on the United States, and as a result, no longer having the maneuverability to be able to act independently and stand up for principles that always have been more important to the Europeans than they have been to the American side, unfortunately. From an American standpoint, we need a Europe that can tell us on our side of the Atlantic when we are having a bad idea. And unfortunately, we have plenty of bad ideas with an increasing pace of them, frankly. We need a Europe that can do what it did in 2003. Unfortunately, it failed, but it had the courage and the integrity to stand up and say that the invasion of Iraq was wrong. That Europe doesn't seem to exist any longer. And that's not only to the detriment of Europe and the international community as a whole, it's a massive detriment to the United States itself. Now, you mentioned what can be done and if there is some space for some optimistic thinking. I don't know if this is optimistic thinking necessarily, but can things be done? Certainly, I hope that there's some leadership in Europe that sees this kind of situation and thinks perhaps there is space and room for leadership from Europe to try to reverse this trend, particularly the trend in terms of the massive erosion that we are seeing when it comes to the norms around the use of force. The war in Gaza, the slaughter in Gaza was not just a war against the Palestinian people, it was a war against international law. Systematic effort to try to destroy it. It's now been echoed here on the American side with Hexet saying that he no longer wants to see woke warfare being pursued, meaning that all kinds of norms around the use of force, including American law itself, should be set aside. And we're seeing how that is being implemented in the war in Iran. These things happened before as well, but now they are being embraced as a new principle rather than as a violation or a neglect of constraints that existed before. I want to take us back to the early 2000s, in which you had an effort by numerous leaders around the world to establish the principle of R2P, a principle that I'm personally not particularly optimistic about. But there was an effort. It was successful in terms of establishing it as a norm. It was adopted in 2005 by the UN, even the Chinese signed on to it. Its implementation afterwards is the reason why it is now essentially a dead norm. But there was that effort, that leadership, and I see space in which European leaders, current and former, can retake the initiative and see, for instance, if there's some additional norms that can be added, but more importantly, if we can have a global recommitment to the Geneva Conventions. It may not sound very sexy, but it is exactly the type of leadership that is needed to be done now, both to be able to halt the erosion of these norms, but also to be able to create a new momentum and strengthen, taking things further and actually adopting new norms that further restrict the manner in which force can be used in international law and further restrict how they can be used without taking into consideration civilian casualties and rights. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Trita. It would be interesting to hear your views about who can take that sort of leadership in Europe, but probably we'll have that during the Q&A. I now move on to Kostas Mavridis for your reflections, please.
Yes. Yeah, I will try to make it short as well. I feel a little bit strange because of this. Usually, in discussions at the European level or in the EU, generally speaking, I'm very critical because of my view that I truly believe in the European project as a peaceful project, and at the same time, I want to improve it. Here, I feel that I need to make a case for the EU because, and I will tell you why. Instead of having like a theoretical discussion, I will concentrate on certain concrete proposals that the EU can take the lead, because I truly believe that had it not for the EU, things would have been much more worse. Of course, I can say I can be critical. It's just I told you I'm very critical in the European Parliament for certain policies of EU. But yes, I think that the European response can be leading to a better future for peace, stability, and prosperity in a concrete way. I will give you two examples. Every student that studies about European studies, and by the way, I'm not coming from European studies, learns about how the EU started. Initially with the Coal and Steel Community Treaty. Well, my idea was, and that's what I tried to promote within the Political Committee for the Mediterranean, that energy can be the source of cooperation between all countries in the area, between both sides of the Mediterranean basin. Of course, this is a vision, and it would not be overnight. It would take years and maybe in decades, but I could see steps towards that. The Mediterranean Pact, for example, and something more. But this is the way forward for EU. If someone has a better offer, let's hear it, but not just stay up to being critical. And one more very concrete example, having Cyprus at the center. As the chair of the Political Committee for Mediterranean, I promoted for five years, and it was adopted by the Assembly, that we need to set up a crisis management center in the area of the Mediterranean, not just for fires, as has already been adopted by the European Commission, but even beyond that, about migration, about climate change, about geopolitics, about drought. I can say many other crises in the area. Therefore, Cyprus, I cannot think of a better place. Cyprus is within EU, and at the same time, we are the bridge between Europe and the countries in the area, all the way towards India. So these are two concrete suggestions or proposals that I have on the table for years. And a last word, taking or borrowing, paraphrasing, in fact, Schuman, who said that Europe would not be built overnight. It would take years and maybe decades, and it would be little step by step, but in a way that member states would build up de facto solidarity. So despite, and this is where I finish, despite being critical many times at the EU, I fully believe, after 12 years in the European Parliament, that only EU can be the best actor for the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Kostas. And now we move on to Ino, please.
Thank you. Look, we are in what we call a foundational moment for Europe. So either we act or we will be marginalized. I am a strong supporter of what we are doing for Ukraine, and also about Ukraine finding its way to the European Union one way or another. Maybe not membership, full membership, but something sort of membership. But we have to persuade our northern friends and colleagues that the same should apply to the south, because the south is equally important for Europe. Look, what we call the Mediterranean basin is the gate of Africa to Europe. And all analyses point to Africa will be a continent exporting, let's say, problems to Europe in the coming decades. Maybe also exporting some good things, but movement of populations, climate change, water, and so on. So we need a strategy connecting Africa to the Mediterranean and Europe. Otherwise, we will have to face problems precipitously, as we often do. This is one point that I would like to make. But this would be, let's say, an optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that this situation that we have now, that I described before, great power competition and middle powers or small powers betting for attention by big powers, this would establish a situation where autocratic regimes will become more autocratic. Because nobody would criticize, nobody will stop them. So we will have, to the detriment of democracy, we will have more autocracy around us. Another very negative development, if we leave it like this. A second, migration should stop, be considered a threat for Europeans, because this nurtures the far-right discourse. So migration is needed in Europe. But we have to orchestrate a framework for migration to become integration. Also, something that we didn't discuss, okay, we cannot discuss everything, let's say, climate change. Climate change will lead to radical transformation of the Mediterranean. Analysts and scientists foresee disappearance of islands. They foresee, how to say, cataclysmic phenomena. So this is something that only through cooperation can be addressed. And last but not least, allow me please to say that, we have to distinguish between Islam and radicalization. Okay, because if we continue, this is also a far-right discourse. Islam is not radicalization only. Islam is suffering from, the Muslims are suffering from radicalization. So there also Europe has to stand and make the distinction.
Great. So I just put down a few words just to sum up the second round. And one of the things I just want to introduce before we have the Q&A is this notion of planetary politics. You know, you ended with the notion of climate change. But there is now an emerging debate about what we are calling humanitarian ecology, that all life on this planet is connected. So we mentioned words like problems, crisis, etc. What happens in one space clearly has serious repercussions in others. And you mentioned the fact of autocracy and authoritarianism in the sort of southern region. But as I mentioned earlier as well, what we are seeing is a very serious democratic backsliding in Europe. And I need us to reflect a bit also about what's happening inside Europe before we start talking about what's happening in the south. The Costas to my further right mentioned this, that we kind of need to see the dangers that are imminent within, because Europe has lost credibility, and therefore we cannot, for example, talk any longer about promotion of democracy in the south, because our own democracy is at stake. So without further ado, I believe we have approximately almost half an hour for discussion. So I'm going to just pose this as a question for the audience to think, but of course, please come with your questions. Let us reflect about whether current European approaches to the region, and I'm thinking here not just about the Mediterranean in its narrow understanding, but the wider Middle East, North Africa, the Gulf, as you mentioned, Ino, whether these are primarily crisis management strategies, so the usual proaction rather than being reactive, and do these approaches within Europe contain in any shape or form that we can see a much longer term political vision that Federica Mogherini mentioned earlier today. So do we have a vision in Europe for coexistence, issues of shared security, shared energy, shared views about migration being positive, etc. So let us think a little bit together about how different policy areas are connected, and whether Europe today, as we stand here at this pivotal transformative moment, has a vision for where we can go together. So I'll take a round of questions and then we can take a second round. So please, all I ask the audience is to briefly say your name so that also Trita, who is online, can hear you. Okay, so make sure you get a mic before you pose the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it relates to your last comment, so about bridging different... sorry, my name is Akram Zawi. I work for a Dubai-based think tank, which is called ORF Middle East. But I will pose a question about the Mediterranean. So first, it's about bridging the different policy areas, which you mentioned. It's about dealing with the major challenges which we will have to deal with, including climate change. But it's also taking into account how disproportionate Europe and the European Union is within the Mediterranean space, notably from an economic and financial standpoint. So Europe also has a resource, as financial resources, which should be allocated strategically. And so my question would relate to a very old topic, which is that of conditionality, and how European financial resources can be used strategically for responsible behavior or for positive behavior from countries in the neighborhood.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Yes, we have the gentleman here, please.
I will tell you something related to the whole issue. If we may, my name is Andreas Psaras. I will tell you something, and I will give you an example. We had a similar experience in our life. It is common sense, and it can be scientifically proven that it serves the interest of the large majority of human race, of humanity, to find civilized ways to resolve issues and have safety and divert resources. I have a study here with figures, tell you the title, employment of the rule of law and human rights in providing security and resolving international disputes so that substantial resources are diverted from destructive and dehumanizing to constructing and benevolent activities. We had a similar experience in my life I will refer to when we said something that seemed unrealistic, and I tell you now, related to this, Albert Einstein said, I have some ideas here in this study from some interesting people. The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. The fact that we accept these tragic things happening around us, the killings, the destruction. And Mahatma Gandhi said, you must not lose faith in humanity. Humanity is an ocean. If few drops of the ocean are dirty, the ocean does not become dirty. It is common sense and it serves the large majority of humanity to find civilized ways. And I also wrote an article related. I wrote an article related that was published in the magazine Foreign Affairs. And in my study, I found that there are 70 cases of nations who solve their problems through legal procedure. Common sense. The problem is to use the procedure, both parties should agree. It's like saying in a civilized society to take a criminal to the court, the criminal could also agree. This is tragic. It's about time to move forward. It's in line with the principles of Europe. It will strengthen the European Union. Yes, there are interests of a very small majority of those people who make the arms, but I have a proposal for them. We give them an incentive in the new system to do something more constructive themselves. So they also have benefit in a new system. So it's about time to move forward, to find civilized ways to avoid all the risks, because what is happening around us and the risks involved are unacceptable and tragic.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Actually, I have two questions. One, a shorter one. In January, a lot of people in Europe fell in love with the Prime Minister of Canada, who opined publicly that the rules-based international order is gone, and there is a perspective which is based on the cooperation of the middle powers. So this notion of the middle powers. So I was wondering if the panelists spotted anything which would be pointing to this direction, that in this region, middle powers playing some kind of positive role, as the Prime Minister of Canada imagined. The other question is referring to, I think, an interesting phenomenon that in the last 1 year in Brussels, probably the most frequently quoted author when it comes to the international disorder has been Antonio Gramsci, who spoke about the time of monstrosity and assuming that there is a kind of transition. And then at the time of the transition, when neither the old nor the new order prevails, then all these things happen. And the question is, if there is a transition, if we assume, is it multipolarity? If it is multipolarity, do the European leaders understand? I agree with the panelists when they emphasized that some kind of positive solution would need to come from the European integration, or the European Union could play a positive role. But at this moment, I think many of the European leaders suffer from some kind of cognitive dissonance because of the lack of understanding of this transition. What it means for the international order, what it can mean for the international order in the future. And there is this attachment to the perceived international order as it had existed before, if it existed before, right? So there's a lot of people are just attached to something which was past.
Thank you, Laszlo. So I just need to make sure that Trita has been privy to hearing these questions, but I'll sum it up anyway. So there's a question about the EU's instrument of conditionality, whether this could be used strategically for positive policies that bridge different areas we spoke about in terms of cooperation. There's a second question about whether Europe, I would call it, could turn back to the principled Europe that we all thought came, about with the coal and steel community. So are there, in other ways, civilized ways in which we can manage and also move forward in terms of all the challenges that Europe faces today? And the third question is about whether there's any role we can foresee in terms of middle powers, and again, moving forward in terms of cooperative frameworks. And the fourth question was whether our panelists see this transition, this transformation that we've been reflecting about as, guiding us towards a new form of multipolarity. And given that Europe seems to be in this cognitive dissonance, as Laszlo put it very nicely, is there a way in which this can turn into a positive new world order? So I'll go in the order of the speakers. So Kostas to my far right first, and then we take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will order all questions, but not necessarily in the same order, if I may. The idea about Europe as we know it, or as we would like to know it, or as we remember it, is actually it is a very challenging prospect. I would agree with Kostas when he was talking about the importance of the coal and steel community and how it was kind of it became an operation to maintain peace in the continent. One thing that we have not discussed at all yesterday and today is actually the idea of capitalism, and this idea that the coal and steel community could be forged because states had control over these particular industries when the treaty was signed. States do not have control over these corporations anymore, okay? Because everything has been privatized to death. So they can do whatever they want. They can sign as many treaties as they want. They have no control whatsoever. So we can see even now with the Strait of Hormuz, we can see it with companies in Israel like Palantir. It's corporate driven, not necessarily nationally driven, these wars. We have to be willing to discuss this kind of idea of renationalizing industries, and then we would be able to have a very fruitful and productive energy alliance. At the moment, we cannot have these things because countries have no power over these kind of things. Even when they say, we found gas in this area, we have to drill. So what? It's not going to belong to you. It's going to belong to another corporation. You have no power whatsoever on this particular thing. Another thing about the civilized Europe as we know it, again, we have to be more tame about our nostalgia. Up until the early 60s, the French were fighting Algeria, so they were not that civilized. So we also have to consider, the Europe's colonial wars and wars to suppress national liberation movements. So there was nothing civilizing or civilized about this particular kind of wars. The middle powers. I'm kind of like intrigued by the idea of the middle power. It's just I do not know who classifies them, who has the power to classify powers. And in my mind, Canada was always a big power because it's a big country and has like oil and has like soft power. Apparently now it's not. So I don't know how to classify this particular thing. But if I'm forced to accept the fact that they're like middle powers, I would say that the way that they liaise with the big powers, which there are like two, China and the US, and we can see that we don't necessarily have ideological inclinations or like ethical kind of arguments here. You can see how many European leaders have been like sucking up to China lately. All of them have gone to Beijing to actually say, please, we're not like Trump. We don't, we're different now. So let's strike a business deal because we're different. Okay, we're will not like these other people. But Europe here, okay, let's lay something nice here, that it shouldn't have any military or kind of like imperial fantasies or ambitions. You know, it should be a soft power. It should be the middle power that brings people together. It should be the middle power that actually says that, you know, we have to not only defend the international order, we have to reinvent the international law order and then defend it. To actually call out violations against human rights, to call out illegal wars, to call out genocide, and then that would be the role of the middle power. And again, when it comes to resources and the climate, of course, you cannot claim to care about the climate where you facilitate wars around the world, when you're selling arms to people. You know, what climate when, you know, the Middle East is like under attack for years and years and years? Even with Ukraine. I mean, we say we help Ukraine. By prolonging a war. We are prolonging a war until the last Ukrainian dies. That's not necessarily help here, because what they're going to say, we won. Who's we? They're all going to be dead. Okay? So we have to actually utilize Europe and mobilize Europe as a middle power that has, focuses and excels at soft power and negotiation tactics. Thank you. So the interagnum and the multipolarity thing, yes, again, I would connect it to this kind of like idea of the middle power, that maybe countries want to be seen as middle powers now because of Carney's kind of like statement, and how they can collaborate together outside of the confines of NATO, of the European Union, and all those kind of things. We can see it in Europe, for instance, that we have the classical formation of the Atlanticists, like Britain, for instance. We have NATO countries who have diversified themselves for this position, like Spain, for instance. They have taken a stance against the American foreign policy, from the outset. We can see it again, as I discussed, with Greece and Cyprus and Israel. They have formed a different alliance here. We can see Spain, Turkey, Norway, who have actually recognized the state of Palestine. They have also treated Hamas as a legitimate political actor. They don't have to like them. They have treated them as legitimate political actors to have a discussion about Gaza and the reconstruction of Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you, Kostas. Trita, please.
Thank you. I'm just going to address one of these questions and perhaps from a bit of a different angle. It was fascinating to me that we've had very little discussion about Trump. And I welcome that sitting here in Washington, it's consuming everything that we're doing otherwise. But one of the things I would caution about for European colleagues is to think that in the post-Trump world, particularly one in which the Democrats take over, that you will have a scenario in which the United States will once again move back to supposedly where it was before. And as a result, many of these issues about multipolarity and international law, what the global order will almost automatically be put back on track towards something more acceptable and tolerable. This is not in any way, shape, or form to say that some of the problematic things done under democratic governments is of the same scale or depth as some of the very frontal assault by the Trump administration on global institutions. But I do want to just caution, because we saw this very clearly happening during the Biden era, which was that the Biden era started to use the term rules-based order and weaponize it, and how this was picked up in Europe, particularly during the Ukraine crisis, in which it became very clear to many of us that Europe actually thought that the rules-based order was identical to the UN Charter and to international law, completely missing that from the American perspective, from the perspective of the Biden administration, they were deliberately using rules-based order in order not to use international law. That there was an effort to create an order that was based on rules, not on laws, because this enabled the United States to be the definer of the rules, which was the case. There's no one who can answer exactly how these rules are coming about, whereas when it comes to the promulgation of international law, the process is very objective and clear and transparent oftentimes. And it is consensual whether countries sign themselves onto international treaties, whereas when it came to the concept of these rules, they were created by a coalition of the willing and then expected to be implemented by all countries, whether they were part of the process, whether they had acceded to these norms or not, or these rules or not. And this risked, and it continues to risk, to not only create a multipolar world, but also a multi-order world in which we would have separate different orders with completely different norms, systems, and laws governing, which would be a much more dangerous situation compared to what we had during the Cold War. So my only caution would be to Europe to not fall into the fallacy of thinking that what we're seeing right now from the American side is some sort of an exception. It's a far greater degree of an assault on the international system compared to what we had under the Biden administration. But it was a highly problematic approach back then as well. And the realization of that on the European side was more or less non-existent in my view, and with very much caution to make sure that once we're past this administration, we don't have the same phenomenon happening again.
Thank you, Trita. So that gives us even more purpose to kind of reflect about how Europe needs to truly, get back to its soul, right? And not rely on the transatlantic relationship. Thank you very much for that. Kostas, to my right, please.
Yes. As far as using conditionality clauses, as the question was the first question, I'm sorry. Yes. All right. Let me start from the beginning. Firstly, I'd like to comment on the question regarding using conditionality clauses by the EU and some of third countries, for example, in financing tools, trade tools, and so on. I'm a supporter of that, although sometimes it didn't work out, sometimes it did. And what I added to that, all right. Okay. So besides the conditionality regarding financing, trade tools, and so on, what I added to that was that my suggestion was whether as EU, we could consider using conditionality of accepting the jurisdiction of International Criminal Court as well, in a way to serve as a deterrent for any criminals or crimes to be committed, as a deterrent, and if it happens, of course, for providing, servicing justice. And this is a proposal which I've been promoting for 12 years now, and we got nowhere, but I will still try to do it. So conditionality is not only with financing and trade tools. Where perhaps I would feel like maybe on this panel, I don't know if I'm going to be alone, but I disagree with the following sense. What is being progressive? What is being progressive? I like the idea before documented by Ino. Progressive we need to make a distinction between what is Islam and what are Muslims. We need to make the distinction between Islam and Islamic radicalization, or Hamas terrorists and Palestinian Authority. We don't serve justice when, in a way, we find wording to present those in the same way. So, and we don't serve progressive agenda. A final word on, oh, by the way, soft power tools, to my understanding, have been tried. They have some impact, but it's not enough, given that around EU we have real threats and real authoritarian regimes, and we need to preserve the European project and understand that defense is not a value. I understand that. Even me, it's very difficult to explain it, but defense is the means to end up with peace, freedom, justice. We need to invest in defense as well, even though defense on its own is not a value. A final word, I'm sorry, about international order. I guess we all agree that the system is falling apart. I would resort again to Thucydides. Thucydides had a lesson that we don't pay attention. It's about the future and future generations. Maybe this is a hopeful, a prospective way to see future with a hope. It says the following: the powerful, the strong, once starts to act militarily without connection with justice and morality, that is the beginning of its downfall. So with that in mind, hopefully we will see the downfall of some of the superpowers that we've seen around us doing immoral things. Thanks for listening to me.
Ino, you have the final word, please.
Yes, thank you. I will limit my replies to what Laszlo said, because I don't feel competent to reply to the other two questions. But what Laszlo said, I think we have to take into consideration very seriously. You know, some years ago, I have published a book, What Europe We Want. And the book was contributions of, at the time, leaders of the Socialist and Social Democrats Party of the European Union, and the majority were Social Democrats and Socialists. So I don't believe that the people are wrong when they vote against a political current. I think the political current is doing something wrong for the people not to vote in favor. Anyway, but this is a long discussion that we can have over lunch, maybe. But the fact is that in today's Europe, even if they are not dominant politically yet, the discourse of the right and far right is quite dominant. So if we don't reverse this course, we will end up having these parties in power, going through this, and then trying to come back to cure what the disaster they would have done. So I'm afraid it can be the case, so we have to be very... So when it comes to middle superpowers, this is a very interesting debate as well. How we consider Europe? Big power? If we don't see Europe as a big power, I think we have lost the game. Europe is, by today's size, is a middle power. But middle power, who else is a middle power? Canada, maybe. Turkey, all right? Saudi Arabia. So can we, I mean, we have to be, we have to go to a vision that transcends this middle power status and working to become a superpower, maybe not as US and China, but at the same level, at least politically, economically, we are. So, and another very crucial issue for this forum, the Progressive Forum, militarization. You mentioned it. Militarization. We need defense. Of course, we need defense. We need to secure our countries, our territories, our people. But militarization, for the time being, is developed to the detriment of the policies that made this political, ideological current dominant, meaning healthcare, education, social protection, social justice. So these are the issues that the progressive forces have to look back at. Because otherwise, I mean, we will lose definitely the distinction between far and right and left. Because for the time being, there is a trend to say there is no right and left. Now we have transcending and we are going towards other political divisions. No, I mean, there are issues that the progressive political forces can build upon, especially now that you have so many challenges. Take artificial intelligence, for example, and what the consequences would be for the labor forces, and so on. Do we have some time? Okay, all right. So, yeah.
Okay, actually, I want to thank you because it kind of frames. I just have three kind of very summary points about the panel. I really want to thank all the panelists, and before we put our hands together for all of them, I just want to say from the conference, actually, I took three main takeaways. One is that Europe needs to call out violations of international norms for what they are. I think that was a general agreement across all the panels. It's important that it stands up for its principles, like we said. Secondly, I think we had a very important reflection about not only where Europe wants to be and go, but also what kind of European society do we want to be there for the next generations to come. And I think that's quite an important reflection that goes with the first as well. And finally, I think as progressives, I would say that we need to bring back the social in social democracy and the democracy in social democracy. I think we need to remember that social democracy represents the people of each society, wherever that is. And I think, you know, at the heart of it lies, of course, what we believe Europe should stand for, right? So I think also Trita's point was very well noted, that we must not, you know, expect that the transatlantic relationship will return back to what it used to be. I think we have now a very different United States, and I agree with Trita there, even the Biden administration was not the kind of United States that we thought we had, I should add. So with that note, I hope we have some food for thought, and I want to thank all the panelists, and please join me in thanking them as well. Thank you, Trita. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.